July 13th, 1943. Lieutenant Toshihiro Oura opened his leather-bound journal for the final time inside a hastily constructed bunker on Munda Point, New Georgia. His hands shook as he wrote by the flickering light of a candle, not out of fear, but from the heavy burden of what he had observed over the past 72 hours. The words he inscribed that night would remain buried in American intelligence files for decades, exposing a truth about the Pacific War that neither the Japanese nor the Allies wished to admit. What he witnessed in those final days would challenge every claim made by Japanese propaganda and Allied reports about the character of warfare in the Solomon Islands. Oura led a strengthened infantry platoon tasked with defending the western approaches to Munda Airfield. His unit had arrived 3 weeks earlier as part of the desperate effort by the Japanese 8th Fleet to retain control of the Solomon Islands chain. Keeping a personal record violated strict military orders. Diaries and personal notes were forbidden to prevent intelligence from falling into enemy hands if a soldier was captured. Yet every evening, Oura wrote carefully, not detailing enemy positions or ammunition counts, but capturing the raw, human truth of what was happening around him. On July 10th, American troops launched their decisive drive toward the airfield. Oura's position came under pressure from units of the 43rd Infantry Division pushing through thick jungle. From his vantage point, he observed the American soldiers through binoculars and noted something that defied the image his men had been taught to expect. They were not the undisciplined, self-reliant fighters described in Japanese military briefings. Instead, they moved with careful synchronization, backed by artillery barrages that arrived with clockwork precision. Even more troubling to Oura was the state of his own men. His journal entries described their worsening condition with detached, almost medical clarity. More than 60% of his platoon was now suffering from malaria. The supply ships promised by the Naval Command never reached them. Rice rations had been reduced to a third of standard portions. His men were starving in a jungle that could have sustained them, but they lacked the strength to search for food and the knowledge to recognize which plants were safe to eat. On July 12th, Oura received orders to maintain his position for another 48 hours to allow the evacuation of headquarters personnel. That night, he penned an entry describing the expressions on his soldiers' faces when he passed along the command. They understood its meaning. There would be no relief. There would be no extraction. They were being left behind to serve as a delay, a sacrifice to buy time for senior officers to escape. His final note on July 13th contained a single paragraph that American translators would later mark as highly significant when the journal was recovered 3 weeks later. The struggle for Munda Point marked a crucial phase in the Allied effort to eliminate Japanese air dominance in the Solomon Islands. Munda Airfield had been operational since December 1942, providing Japanese bombers and fighters with a forward base to threaten Allied shipping and shore installations across the region. Gaining control of Munda would shift the balance of air power in the Central Solomons. The New Georgia campaign began on June 30th, 1943, when American troops landed on nearby Wendover Island to set up artillery emplacements within firing range of Munda. The Japanese garrison protecting the airfield numbered around 10,000 men, but they were plagued by severe disadvantages. Their maritime supply routes had been cut off by relentless American air and submarine attacks. The dense jungle, which should have provided cover and defensive advantage, instead became a prison as illness and hunger weakened units faster than enemy fire. Lieutenant Oura's platoon reflected the typical makeup of Japanese forces in the Solomons by mid-1943. His men included regular infantry and hastily assigned replacements. Many had been pulled from garrison duty in Manchuria and had no experience in jungle, combat, or tropical diseases. The Japanese High Command operated under the belief that fighting spirit and aggressive tactics would overcome shortages in equipment and supplies. Oura's journal would go on to expose the deadly cost of this assumption. The American forces advancing on Munda adopted a deliberate, methodical strategy that sharply contrasted with traditional Japanese tactics. Instead of charging forward, they secured supply routes, established field medical stations, and coordinated large-scale artillery barrages before each movement. This systematic approach frustrated Japanese commanders who anticipated fast, disorganized assaults they could disrupt with ambushes and close-range fighting. Oura noticed this pattern and grasped its significance. His journal entries from late June through mid-July 1943 offered American intelligence an extraordinary glimpse into Japanese defensive operations and morale. The document was found on August 3rd, when Marine patrols secured the Western Bunker Complex, where Oura's unit had made its last stand. The journal was discovered in a waterproof pouch, along with Oura's personal belongings and military papers. When translated, it revealed details that contradicted American assumptions about Japanese military resilience. Intelligence analysts had long believed that Japanese units remained cohesive and combat effective until completely destroyed. Oura's journal showed a different picture. His unit had already begun to collapse weeks before the final American attack, not due to enemy action, but because of systemic failures in supply and medical care. The entries from early July described the daily routine of a unit in irreversible decline. Morning roll calls revealed men too weak to stand. Medical supplies were limited to bandages and iodine, no quinine to treat malaria, no antibiotics for infected wounds, no plasma for shock. Oura noted that his unit's medic took his own life on July 8th after watching 3 soldiers die from dysentery that could have been treated. The medic left behind a note expressing his despair at being unable to do anything as men perished from preventable causes. Food shortages became critical by the second week of July. The journal documented the disintegration of the naval supply network meant to support Japanese garrisons across the Solomons. Oura's unit had been promised regular deliveries via fast destroyer runs, the so-called Tokyo Express, which had once successfully supplied Guadalcanal, but American air dominance had rendered those missions nearly impossible. The last supply drop his unit received came on June 24th, almost 3 weeks before the final battle. The journal showed how rapidly malnutrition eroded combat effectiveness. By July 10th, Oura estimated that fewer than 30 of his original 85 men were still capable of fighting. The others were incapacitated by illness, starvation, or wounds that would not heal due to weakened bodies. He described soldiers who could scarcely lift their rifles, who nodded off during guard duty, not out of neglect but sheer exhaustion, who suffered hallucinations from fever and hunger. What made Oura's observations especially valuable to American intelligence was his analytical mindset. Unlike most captured documents, which focused on tactical details or ideological rhetoric, Oura's journal sought to understand the deeper reasons behind his unit's collapse. He had been trained at the Imperial Japanese Army Academy and had studied military history and logistics. His entries compared Japanese and American operational methods with remarkable clarity. On July 11th, Oura wrote a detailed analysis of American artillery tactics. He observed that American guns fired according to strict schedules, timed to match infantry advances. The bombardments were not random harassment, but carefully calculated strikes meant to neutralize specific defensive positions ahead of an attack. He noted that American forward observers maintained constant communication with artillery units, adjusting fire in real time based on impact. In contrast, Japanese artillery, when available, fired prearranged barrages with no means of correction. The journal described the psychological toll of this methodical American strategy. Oura's men had been trained to expect bold enemy offensives they could repel with counterattacks and hand-to-hand combat. Instead, they faced an enemy that moved slowly, deliberately, shielded by waves of artillery and airstrikes. There was no chance for the close-quarters battle that Japanese doctrine prioritized. The Americans simply advanced, obliterating defensive positions with overwhelming firepower before their infantry even came within range. Oura recorded conversations with other officers in nearby sectors. They shared his growing realization that Japanese tactical doctrine had become obsolete. The emphasis on courage and aggression assumed an even match in firepower and supply against an enemy that possessed overwhelming material superiority and a systematic way of fighting. Traditional Japanese tactics had become suicidal. Yet command continued to issue orders based on outdated assumptions about how battles were supposed to unfold. The most important entries in the journal came in the final days before Oura's death. On July 12th, he wrote about receiving the order to hold his position for 48 hours. He understood immediately that this was a death sentence. Headquarters was escaping by barge to Kolombangara Island, leaving forward units behind to slow the American advance. Oura did not condemn the decision in his journal. He merely recorded it as confirmation of what he had already come to believe about the campaign's inevitable outcome. That same entry included Oura's analysis of why the order to stand firm was militarily meaningless. His unit no longer had the strength to delay a determined American assault for more than a few hours. The men were too weak, too ill, too broken to offer meaningful resistance. A tactical withdrawal to regroup and preserve fighting strength would have made more strategic sense. Instead, his unit was to be sacrificed for negligible benefit, simply because doctrine required that positions be held until destroyed. Oura spent July 13th preparing his men for the inevitable. The journal described his efforts to sustain morale among soldiers who knew they had been forsaken. He organized the remaining food into a final meal. He distributed ammunition, though many men were too weak to carry full loads. He wrote letters on behalf of soldiers who wanted final messages sent to their families, fully aware that those letters would likely never reach their destinations. His last journal entry, written that evening, contained no grand speeches or patriotic affirmations. Instead, Oura wrote a sober, clinical reflection on what he had learned. He wrote that the Japanese Empire was not losing the war because its soldiers lacked bravery. Every man under his command had proven willing to die for their country. They were losing because the enemy had built systems that made personal courage meaningless. The Americans had systems to feed troops in the jungle, to treat malaria, to deliver ammunition, to coordinate artillery and air support, to evacuate the wounded, and to replace losses. Japan had slogans about fighting spirit. Oura ended his journal with a prediction. He wrote that unless Japan could match American logistical and organizational capabilities, the war would end in total defeat, no matter how bravely individual soldiers fought. Tactical victories might occur, but strategic success required the systematic approach that only the Americans had mastered. His final sentence expressed a hope that someone, someday, would read his words and understand that courage alone could never defeat an enemy with superior systems. The fall of Munda Airfield on August 5, 1943, confirmed Oura's predictions. Japanese forces withdrew to Kolombangara and eventually abandoned the Central Solomons entirely. The campaign proved that Japanese defensive tactics could not overcome American advantages in resources and organization. Every major battle that followed in the Pacific followed the pattern Oura had identified. Methodical American advances grinding down Japanese positions that lacked sufficient supply and support. The journal also revealed the human cost of Japan's strategic failures. Oura's unit suffered an 85% casualty rate, yet fewer than 20% of those casualties resulted from direct combat. Most died from disease, starvation, and lack of medical care. This pattern repeated across Japanese garrisons throughout the Pacific. Soldiers died not from enemy bullets, but from their own military's inability to keep them alive in the field. Oura's observations about American artillery tactics proved especially prescient. The seamless coordination between forward observers, artillery batteries, and infantry units became the hallmark of American operations across the Pacific. This integration of firepower and maneuver allowed American forces to advance with relatively low losses while inflicting heavy casualties on defenders. The journal's analysis of morale and combat effectiveness challenged both Japanese and American wartime narratives. Japanese propaganda claimed that spiritual strength could overcome material deficiencies. American propaganda depicted Japanese soldiers as fanatical warriors who fought to the death. Oura's journal revealed a more nuanced reality. Japanese soldiers were willing to fight, but they were being destroyed by failures beyond their control. Intelligence analysts who reviewed the journal after the war noted that Oura had identified the core imbalance of the Pacific War. Japan's military culture valued individual heroism and aggressive tactics. America's military culture valued systematic planning and logistical superiority. In a prolonged conflict, systems always prevailed over heroism. The journal also documented the breakdown of Japanese naval supply operations. Oura's unit was supposed to receive regular deliveries via the Tokyo Express destroyer runs. By July 1943, American air power had made those missions suicidal. Japanese commanders continued to plan operations assuming functioning supply lines, even as those lines collapsed. Oura recognized this disconnect between planning and reality. Modern military analysts have used Oura's journal as a case study in the importance of logistics and systems thinking. His observations on the connection between supply, morale, and combat effectiveness are taught at military academies as real-world examples of how wars are truly won and lost. The journal demonstrates that tactical skill and personal bravery matter far less than organizational strength and systematic support. The fate of Oura's men after his death reflected his final predictions. The survivors of the July 14th assault were too weak to retreat effectively. Most were captured or died, trying to reach Japanese lines on Kolombangara. American medical staff who treated captured Japanese soldiers were stunned by their physical condition. Many required weeks of recovery from malnutrition and disease before they could even be questioned. Lieutenant Oura's journal stands as one of the most honest and insightful evaluations of Japanese military failures in the Pacific War, written by someone still in active service. His analysis proved tragically accurate. Japan's emphasis on fighting spirit and tactical aggression could not compensate for systematic American superiority in logistics, coordination, and material support. Every major battle from Munda onward followed the pattern he described. The significance of the journal extends beyond its immediate historical context. Oura identified a fundamental truth about modern warfare that remains relevant today. Wars are not won primarily by individual acts of bravery or tactical brilliance. They are won by organizations that can sustain operations over time, that can coordinate complex systems, and that can adapt and learn from experience. The side with superior systems will defeat the side with better slogans. Oura's final words expressed hope that his observations might be read and learned from. His journal was indeed read by American intelligence officers, who used his insights to deepen their understanding of Japanese vulnerabilities. Decades later, historians and military analysts continue to study his words as a case study in how wars are truly decided. The men under Oura's command did not die because they lacked courage. They died because their military system failed them. They starved in a jungle that could have fed them. They perished from illnesses that could have been cured. They fought without adequate ammunition or support. Their sacrifice achieved nothing of strategic value. Oura understood this, and he wrote it down, hoping that his honesty might spare future soldiers from the same fate. The Pacific War would continue for 2 more years after Munda fell. The pattern Oura identified would repeat on every island, in every jungle, on every beach where Japanese and American forces clashed. One side had systems, the other had slogans. The outcome was never in doubt once that difference became clear.